The oil tanker was 20 minutes from the blockade line when it made its move. No warning, no radio communication, no request for authorization. The vessel, named Rich Starry, simply adjusted its course, increased speed, and headed straight toward the U.S. Navy's enforcement corridor in the Strait of Hormuz, as if the blockade didn't exist. On the bridge of an American warship, all the screens lit up at once, and what happened in the minutes that followed sent a message that echoed from Washington to Beijing to Tehran. Not because of what the tanker was carrying, not because of its destination, but because of who sent it, and because of what happened when the largest naval force ever assembled in that strait responded instantly, decisively, without hesitation. China had just tested the blockade, and the United States had just responded to the test. But here is what no one is saying about that moment. The oil tanker turning back was not the most important event that took place. The most important event was what it revealed about a confrontation that had been building for years, hidden beneath the surface of trade agreements, diplomatic statements, and carefully worded communiques coming out of Beijing. For the first time in decades, the gulf between what China says it can do and what China can actually do was laid bare in public, in real time, on the world's most closely watched waterway. And the implications of this exposure go far beyond a single oil tanker turning around. Stay with me, because what is unfolding in the Strait of Hormuz right now is not just a story about Iran. It's a story about the real limits of Chinese power, and the world is about to discover exactly where those limits lie. The numbers speak for themselves. On April 13, 2026, the U.S. Navy shut down Iran's entire export system in a single morning. Karg Island, the heart of Iran's oil infrastructure, through which approximately 90% of Iranian oil flows, shut down. Chabahar, the alternative gateway that China had carefully cultivated with billions in investments to bypass Hormuz, shut down. Bandar Abbas, the entry and exit point for virtually everything moving to and from Iran by sea, shut down. Every channel through which Beijing had been buying sanctioned, discounted Iranian oil was simultaneously sealed off. The Iranian leg of the Belt and Road became operationally useless overnight. Billions of dollars in Chinese infrastructure investment left abandoned, and the U.S. force deployed in the theater is on a scale without modern precedent. 3 aircraft carrier strike groups, anchored by the USS Abraham Lincoln, the USS Gerald R. Ford, and the USS George H.W. Bush. More than 15 warships, F-35C and FA-18 fighters, flying continuous combat air patrols. P-8 Poseidon aircraft sweeping every inch of the surface, submarines operating below. More than 50,000 U.S. military personnel in the theater. On the other side, the data China cannot dispute. 190 million barrels of Iranian oil loaded and ready, stranded at sea with no destination. 3 tankers linked to China, Rich Starry, Austria, and at least one other vessel, turned back in quick succession. Not a shot fired, no confrontation, no standoff. Just a turnaround, and a message received. And here's what the mainstream media isn't showing. The Chinese Defense Minister, Admiral Dong Jun, took to a podium and delivered words designed to sound like power. He said Chinese ships had passed through Hormuz. He said China had agreements with Iran. He said the United States should not interfere in Chinese affairs. Strong words, commanding words, words that were broadcast across all Chinese state media and circulated through diplomatic channels worldwide. And yet, no ship was protected by those words. Not a single oil tanker moved through the corridor that Dong Jun implied China had the right and the will to defend. The gulf between the statement and reality was visible to every navy, every intelligence service, every government watching this crisis unfold. And that gulf is precisely where the most dangerous calculation of this entire conflict now lies. This is the central revelation. For the first time in decades, China's claim to the status of a peer competitor with the United States was tested in the real world, on the high seas, and fell short. The Rich Starry's U-turn carries weight far beyond the oil it was carrying. It was the moment when the gap between Chinese words and Chinese actions was measured before every government on the planet. And the result was laid bare. The last time the world experienced a dynamic even remotely similar to this was in 1962, when Soviet cargo ships approached an American naval blockade around Cuba. The crisis is remembered as the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. Military analysts observing this crisis are deliberately drawing that comparison. The 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis lasted 13 days. It ended because one side blinked, because someone in Moscow looked at the American blockade line, looked at the military reality of what lay beyond it, and calculated that the cost of pushing forward exceeded anything that could be gained. In 2026, the same fundamental equation is playing out in a different strait, with different actors and different weapons. But the core logic is identical. Military power is drawing a line. Diplomatic channels are the only path to a resolution that does not end catastrophically. China is not in a position to risk that confrontation, not with tensions in Taiwan already high, not with its economy already absorbing serious damage from U.S. tariffs, not in a theater where U.S. military superiority is overwhelming and unequivocal. And there is a second historical parallel that this crisis exposes. For decades, Iranian military doctrine rested on a single strategic pillar. The ability to close the Strait of Hormuz made Iran untouchable. The threat of such a closure deterred military action. An actual closure gave Tehran leverage over every economy on the planet. Hormuz was Iran's weapon, its deterrent, its insurance policy against the overwhelming conventional military power mobilized against it. Since Operation Epic Fury began, that leverage has been systematically stripped away. Iran's air defense collapsed in the first weeks of the campaign. More than 100 coalition aircraft entered Iranian airspace, struck the center of Tehran, and returned without losses. Underground facilities described as impenetrable were penetrated by B-2 bombers carrying bunker-busting munitions. The Bushehr naval base was leveled. The IRGC's chain of command was shattered. Intelligence chiefs and operations commanders were killed. The logistics hub in Imam Ali was struck. Supply chains to Hezbollah and the Houthis were severed. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, sent oil prices soaring past $150, triggered fuel crises across Europe, caused genuine economic pain throughout Asia, paralyzed global shipping, and proved that its ultimate deterrent was real. And then, America responded. Not by reopening the strait and restoring the previous status quo, by taking the strait from Iran entirely, by systematically clearing the mines, by establishing a safe corridor, by opening it to global trade, and simultaneously locking every Iranian port behind a blockade that prevents oil from leaving while letting everything else flow freely. The strait is open to everyone except Iran. Iran's weapon has been turned against Iran. Iran's logic has been reversed and used with superior force against the country that invented the tactic. Here is the layer that no one is discussing. China's problem is not the loss of Iranian oil. That is manageable, at least in the short term. China maintains approximately 130 days of strategic oil reserves. It can draw down those reserves. It can find alternative suppliers at higher prices. It can absorb the immediate disruption painfully, but functionally. The real problem is Hormuz itself, and the numbers explain exactly why. China imports more than 10 million barrels of oil every day, almost entirely by sea. Approximately 40% of that supply transits the Strait of Hormuz, not just from Iran, but from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Qatar. Add it all up, roughly half of China's total maritime oil supply depends on that single waterway operating freely. As long as the U.S. Navy controls the strait, China's energy security is, in a very direct and immediate sense, at the mercy of American decisions. And this is where this crisis hits home. China's industrial base, its manufacturing capacity, its political stability, all depend on accessible and reliable energy supplies. The Communist Party's domestic legitimacy rests on delivering continuous economic growth to 1.4 billion people who have been told their country is becoming a superpower. In practice, every American decision in Hormuz affects the electricity bill in Guangzhou, the price of diesel in Shanghai, and the cost of manufacturing that produces almost everything you buy. China has already halted exports of gasoline and diesel, squeezing Japan and South Korea, and weakening regional rivals that depend on Chinese fuel re-exports. It has begun buying American LNG, resuming imports it had suspended during the trade war, attempting to create diplomatic leverage through economic engagement, even as the military confrontation intensifies. It is positioning itself as an indispensable fuel supplier to Southeast Asian nations desperate for alternatives, expanding regional influence even as its own energy situation deteriorates. China is suffering, but it is trying to ensure that its rivals suffer more. And there is yet another invisible layer that no one is discussing. Every American asset concentrated in Hormuz is an asset that cannot simultaneously be present in the Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea, or the Baltic Sea. Maintaining 3 aircraft carrier strike groups indefinitely in a single theater is logistically punishing. Aircraft carriers require constant maintenance cycles. Personnel rotation schedules restrict sustained operations. Ammunition, resupply, and fuel logistics for a force of this size are substantial operations in and of themselves. And crucially, Allied support for the blockade was far more limited than Washington projected. The United Arab Emirates and Bahrain announced support. The United Kingdom explicitly stated that it would not join the blockade operation, focusing instead on mine clearance and ensuring humanitarian navigation. Germany and Australia declined to participate. France is conducting its own independent navigation mission with the United Kingdom, explicitly separate from the U.S. blockade. The United States is running the most significant naval operation of the 21st century, largely on its own. And the blockade itself, while operationally effective, is not absolute. Ship tracking data confirms that at least 7 vessels linked to Iran have transited the strait since the operation began. 3 of them were under active U.S. sanctions. The Rich Starry turned back on the first attempt but transited on the second. The blockade is real. The blockade is working. But the blockade is not absolute. And this gap between official policy and operational reality is where China is testing, probing, and pushing every day. So what does Beijing do now? 3 possible futures are now at stake, and which one materializes will be determined by decisions being made right now in Beijing, Tehran, and Washington. Future 1. Diplomacy. Iran returns to the negotiating table with a counterproposal built on the framework presented in Islamabad. The nuclear issue is addressed in language that allows the regime to claim something while conceding the central demand. China's silent pressure on Tehran, pressure that Beijing cannot acknowledge publicly, but which intensifies every day as its own energy security deteriorates, tips the calculation toward an agreement. The blockade is lifted. A framework is signed. The strait returns to normal operation under international supervision. This is the future Washington is projecting. The entire architecture of maximum pressure, the blockade, the $13 billion squeeze, the 2-week stockpile countdown, is engineered to make this future the only rational choice for Tehran. Future 2. Escalation. Iran activates the Houthis. Bab el-Mandeb, the second most strategically important waterway on the planet, is simultaneously disrupted. A Chinese convoy tests the blockade with a quasi-military escort and creates a confrontation that neither Beijing nor Washington fully controls. The ceasefire collapses. Military operations resume under an even tighter blockade. Oil prices break through levels that trigger a genuine global recession. The conflict expands beyond the limits any party originally intended. This is the future no one wants, but it is the future that becomes more likely with every day that the diplomatic window narrows. Future 3. Prolonged stalemate. The blockade remains in place but does not force Iran to the table quickly enough. U.S. logistical sustainability comes into question. Allied support fails to materialize. China continues to probe the blockade with sanctioned tankers, some managing to slip through, maintaining a trickle of Iranian oil that slightly extends Tehran's runway. The crisis drags on without resolution, inflicting growing economic pain on every party involved, restructuring global energy markets around alternatives to Hormuz that take years to build, and leaving a region permanently scarred by a confrontation from which no one can find a way out. The Chinese tankers turned back. The Chinese defense minister issued strong words that could not protect a single ship. Beijing calculates but takes no risks. And that calculation, that deliberate choice to step back from the line, may be the most important variable in determining whether this crisis finds a way out or becomes something the world cannot contain. The gap between words and action defines the true balance of power in the 21st century. And in the Strait of Hormuz, that gap is being measured in real time, one tanker at a time, one execution decision at a time, one day at a time, while the oil storage clock counts down to a moment that changes everything. Hormuz is no longer Iran's weapon. Hormuz is now Iran's cage, and the world holds its breath to see who blinks first. Subscribe to this channel, because we're going to track this, every day one tanker at a time until the moment someone blinks.